Hello, my name is Dustin Hosseini, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the hows and whys of using discussions for learning and teaching. Again, my name is Dustin. I've worked in education since 2005. I used to teach English for academic purposes, English as a foreign language, and then I worked in learning development. And most recently, I've been working since about 2017 in kind of digital education, but I've always used technology in any kind of teaching and learning that I've done. So I hope this session will be of some use to you. Just so you know, you will have a copy of the slides and you'll find notes in the slides that you can kind of draw on. There's literature, there's references that kind of help support what I'm saying, especially if you're interested in finding out more. So quick session overview. We're going to talk about an intro to kind of online discussions, how we can create these effectively. I'll show you kind of two case studies because I think it's important that you maybe have a clear idea of what they can look like, and also good tips and kind of good practices along the way. I will be using examples from STEM, especially nursing, engineering, computer science. That way you can see how these kind of forums or discussions, asynchronous discussions, can be applicable to your own kind of subject areas. So, just quickly, why would we use these? Why would we use online discussions? First of all, they are a way of kind of engaging learners in a blended way or a fully online way, but also creating community. Creating community for learners is particularly important, especially when you're, say, in the online space or in a blended space where you may not see students regularly. So, in particular, they also allow for students to exercise their critical thinking. You can do this in many ways. It depends on the topic. But some common ways I can think of from education, for example, which particularly relates to nursing, or perhaps even engineering when you talk about problem solving, is reflecting on practices, reflecting on what has been done. Also reflecting on issues and dilemmas, so problems that may not have solutions that are immediately identifiable, or that may just not have an answer, okay? They can also be really great for looking at analyses of examples and case studies, okay, in a way that perhaps in the in-person setting you might not have time for due to time constraints. So in terms of blended learning and online learning, these can be a particular powerful way of extending the classroom, extending learning, while still maintaining contact with students in a very meaningful way. Other ways, they can promote discussions in particular, especially online discussions, and of course in person, but online they can promote active learning, right, through allowing students a lower pressure environment in which they can respond. This is especially helpful for students who may be shy, who are neurodivergent, because it addresses the issue of kind of inclusivity and accessibility in learning and teaching. This asynchronous method can allow, again, learners who are shyer, more reticent, or who may not want to kind of ask or respond in a live situation, that opportunity to kind of respond in the online space. Another thing is it can help with what's called mitigating the transactional distance between students and educators. So while researching this kind of talk, I came across a blog, and apparently there's quite a bit of research on transactional distance with respect to blended and online learning. What that is that's the space that is created between students and educators, especially in the online learning space. In other words, I'll give you an example from my own experience. I study a doctorate in education. I started during the pandemic, and we had online discussion forums using the Moodle kind of discussion forums. I've also seen these work on Teams. In any case, the forums, wherever they're held, are places to maintain that community, to maintain contact with students, and to effectively reduce that transactional distance between learners and teachers, students and educators. What that means is it's creating a regular touch point that's hopefully meaningful in nature, that will allow learners and teachers to come together in a more meaningful way, while kind of, again, reducing any barriers of simply having no contact, especially when it comes to online learning. And in blended learning as well. So in blended learning, you may meet the class 3 times a week for 1 hour, as just an example. That may be enough. But by building in a kind of discussion forum, it increases that a little bit for students and can make them feel safer, heard, paid attention to, but also it creates community with the learners, with the teachers as well, for kind of maintaining the learning in a meaningful way. So how do we do this? How do we create effective online discussions? Well, my years of practice has told me there are many ways of doing this, but really it comes down to the educator. It comes down to the educator looking at their curriculum and seeing what questions they can ask, what meaningful questions that they can ask, okay? Some basic tips. You need to set expectations to students. You also need to set a framework for students as well. This is done through being very clear about what you expect from students, but also done by giving them examples of maybe good practices, so that you're not just giving them a blank slate to work from. Again, this goes back to inclusivity. Some students who may be neurodivergent, they will need just a framework to work from. That way they can do the best that they can. Also being flexible. So the first time you try discussions, you need to be flexible, experimenting, so on and so forth, that we can learn from how things go. So that means perhaps listening to student feedback, maybe even asking them what they might imagine these forums might discuss or focus on. A couple of practical examples. A few years ago at Glasgow University, one of our colleagues, Sarah Honeychurch and Shazia Ahmed, used discussion forums as spaces to support the learning and teaching of first-year psychology students and also, I believe, first-year mathematics and statistics students. These spaces were particularly powerful for allowing students to ask silly questions, right? That's just one way of using online discussion forum. But silly questions around problems that they just couldn't get, they didn't understand it. So that's why I would say that offering meaningful questions, problems, and issues that students can discuss is particularly important. I'll show you some examples later, but in the case of the students that I've just mentioned, one example, they would take a picture of a problem that they were working on. They would say, I have worked through these steps, however, I'm still stuck. What am I doing wrong? And rather than a student just saying, this is the answer, they would walk through, in text of course, the answer with the student, okay, in order to show the student where steps were missed. Now that's in relation to mathematics and statistics, so that might not be the case for kind of everything. In terms of other possible, well, maybe specific possible example activities, these are just 3 of many, and in the slides again, I've given you a few links to a few documents. Field trips at a distance. Students may not be able to travel somewhere to kind of understand the geography of something, or perhaps the local cultural history of something, for example. But you can construct a kind of field trip at a distance where you set a framework, they perhaps read something, they watch a video, they listen to a podcast, and then you set a meaningful question. Brainstorming, in this case, you might have a topic that students are researching or studying, and you might want them to collaboratively kind of create a bunch of ideas around a particular topic. Great question because it motivates students to actively learn and engage. This is similar to the next one, creating a topic or research bank. Again, you might want students to create something collectively together, and an online space such as on Teams or Slack or even Moodle Forum or maybe any other kind of forum space would be appropriate for doing this. And in the end, the result is there's a database or a piece of work that people can share collectively for their own learning and teaching and for whatever else. Now, what's important to remember is you need to write good discussion prompts, and they're not it does take some thought. It's not as easy as we would think. We need to really think about the different types of questions and thinking. And I've taken this from a particular resource, which is in the slides as well. 3 types of thinking that you can employ to writing good questions. There's convergent, divergent, and evaluative thinking. Convergent thinking is asking those typical how and why questions. Why must we write a practical lab report after the fact? Yeah. So it's just exploring those reasons why. Also, how questions, how do the terms of race and ethnicity differ? What's the difference between these two? Okay. Divergent thinking is where you get students to perhaps engage more actively by getting them to imagine certain things or reflect on certain things. So imagine you were creating a website for a client. What might your needs analysis include? Okay, so this is an unreal situation. It's an imaginary situation if you want to think about it like that. That's the kind of questions that divergent thinking kind of looks at. Where again, convergent thinking, we're probably looking at something that we can draw upon immediately. Evaluative thinking is where you might have the students justify their thinking based upon research or experience or practical wisdom around a topic. So for example, nursing students, you might ask them defend the use of an ice pack to reduce swelling for a concussion. Okay? Or computer science engineering, justify the use of the agile method for project work. Okay? And again, these are discussions that can be then responded to by different students in the kind of duration of the discussion. And again, remember, it's important to set parameters. So say if you do ask them to justify, why must we write a lab report after a practical? I would say, okay, in 200 words, answer this question, and then maybe reply to 2 other people. That way it gives a clear framework. 2 case studies that we're going to look at, one from medicine and one is an imagined one from kind of computer science and coding. The one from medicine is very interesting because it's actually from one of our colleagues here at Glasgow University, Fiona Sin. She teaches on a postgraduate level course on infant mental health, and the learners are mostly adults, professional learners wishing to further their knowledge experience. She used discussions to kind of provoke critical reflections on practice and discussions around the topics and issues being discussed. For ethics, all responses and images have been anonymized, and the platform that they used was Microsoft Teams. So as we look here in this case study 1, what they did was they started the discussion. How did they do that? They asked a question around examining terminology and implications for these while considering practices or impacts. As you can see here, the question is, do you think terms like statistically normal or neurotypical are helpful? What might some of the positives and negatives be of thinking about children in this way? You can pause the video at this moment, and I suggest you do, and just read through that first response. As you see, or as you hopefully will see, the learning type is active in nature because the question provides a clear framework that uses the learner's learning and practice to kind of create a critical response that is dialogic in nature. Why have they done this? Because the question and the responses encourage a dialogue among learners to kind of further their understanding. Here are subsequent responses between the learners. So this is the dialogue as it is happening. Now, as you can see, the learners respond to one another. They comment on how they value the interpretations, the thoughts that the other person has shared. They also expand upon certain things. For example, I definitely think moving away from language away from a deficit model is important for mental health of those who are neurodivergent as well as population. And they kind of expand upon that reasoning and rationale. And of course, as you can see here, students can like and respond to different kind of comments and posts. Again, this is kind of another response. And again, the learner, what do? They acknowledge contributions of others. They exhibit listening through this acknowledgement, which deepens their understanding and their learning of the topic. And it also builds upon prior responses while tying in their own views. So again, what I'd highly recommend is pause these kind of sections where I'm showing you and just read through. And then, of course, here's kind of one of the last responses that the lecturer shared. As far as reflections, this is a reflection directly from the lecturer. So as you see, as students shared their own reflections, they also began to interact with one another, reflecting back, adding to their contributions, which, according to the lecturer, has enhanced the learning experience of the students because they get to triangulate the learning from not only the content, the lecturer's view, but also the view of each other. Now, in nursing and in education, this is very important. I would say in computer science, especially within the realm of like coding, creating programs, also very important. You have a knowledge base, you have the experts, so to speak, and then you have the users, the learner users who are kind of doing things. The next slide is an imagine slide, imagine case study rather, so computer science. You can use this from any, perhaps computer science or related area. The learners could be from any kind of area. And the rationale for using this would be to kind of, again, provoke critical reflections and problem solving through discussion and peer review and analysis. So here's an example for you computer scientists, right? This is a guess the number game, okay? Now, within Microsoft Teams, for example, you can insert code. I believe in others as well, Moodle forums, I believe as well, and probably other platforms you can also insert code in this effect. And this is where you might have students examining examples to, again, look for errors in the code. Because as far as this subject goes, it is very important to get certain things right. This, again, gives students a critical space, a critical and active space to problem solve, but also to help one another understand, okay, why is this wrong? And how can we fix it? And then I've given you, my colleague has given some kind of examples about why it's wrong. Just in case you're wondering, there is the kind of correct guess the number game answer. And again, just to kind of emphasize, it can be used for peer review via discussion, using coding to experiment with tools like ChatGPT, but it also can help learners to see the problem, find the issues within the code, and experiment with answers. Lastly, just some good practices and further tips from my experience and just from reading around the topic. It is very important to set parameters by setting clear expectations. So if you wish, for example, your learners to engage in discussions, you should give them ideally a word count limit, or even maybe a paragraph limit. A typical one might be, in 200 words, provide a response that considers one aspect of the problem, provide your analysis and application of the problem to a specific context. Okay, that way you're providing an active learning framework that sets clear expectations around how much time they should spend engaging with the problem, but also how long of an answer. Okay, and as someone who used to teach English for academic purposes and English as a foreign language, it's very important to give your learners a kind of frame, because you don't want one student writing 10 paragraphs or 3 pages, but then another student writes 1 line. This is where the framework can help. Also, a follow-up might be particularly helpful, as in this example. When you're finished, read through the responses of your peers and respond to 1 or 2 of the peers by extending their answer through analysis or by reflecting on your own practice. It's always very useful and important to also scaffold the learning, so do give model answers. That way you can demonstrate to students what you expect. Be clear about deadlines, be clear about your own availability. Obviously, You don't want to give the expectation to students that you might reply to all of the forum discussions. That's not something you should do in any case. That's not a good practice unless you wish to do that, but that will take you time. But perhaps set expectations around, when might you look at these next week? A certain day. How many might you respond to, if you will? And of course, it's always important to kind of set expectations around creating a respectful and community environment. And there are many ways of doing that, but again, modeling it is a very good way. Lastly, carefully consider, again, questions that are meaningful, important, and applicable. So students do like a challenge, but of course don't make it too challenging, and also don't make it too irrelevant. It's great to have an icebreaker as a discussion forum, where you might, in the first forum, ask students, why are you taking this course, and what do you hope to get out of it? And maybe tell us something that you enjoy doing in your free time, for example. But if you're talking about the actual content, do think carefully about that. I would say carefully consider whether you wish to assess participation in forums. Personally, I would advise against it, mainly because it can be tricky. It also can be construed as potentially busy work for students. It's completely acceptable to have maybe 1 or 2 discussion forums that might be assessed, but I would not have one every week, just because that will add to your workload and their workload as well. So if you have a lot of GTAs who can help you mark and read through, go for it. If you don't, I would highly recommend you not do that. In terms of the frequency, I would say once every 2 weeks is probably a nice sweet spot. Once a week might be too much, unless it's, again, just a kind of pastoral type discussion where, how are we doing this week? What are we doing well and what are we struggling with? But again, that's not really a forum. That's more of a touch point. If you're talking about a genuine discussion forum where they're talking about their content critically, actively, I would say once every 2 weeks is probably good. That way, you set it in 1 week. There's a week for them to participate and a week for them to respond to one another, and also those 2 weeks for you to kind of look through things. 2 other things you may want to consider are, again, what I've touched upon, which is focus. Do you want it to be totally focused on the content? Or perhaps is it going to be a more global way of looking at things? So not only the pastoral community side, but also the actual content. And of course, do you want maybe a separate forum just about the assessments where students can ask questions? If you do one for this, I would highly recommend perhaps keeping it anonymous. That way students can ask silly questions and not feel silly. This is a very commonly used approach that's pretty successful because it allows students to ask questions that are making them either anxious or nervous, and they don't want to feel silly for asking them. Finally, a couple of things, subject-specific forums. If you work in coding or computer sciences, programming, so on and so forth, GitHub is a very big place where a lot of discussions happen, usually around code and programs and so on and so forth. But I would highly recommend looking at some of these resources. You probably may already know about these resources anyway. As far as nursing, the Royal College of Nursing, as just one example of probably many, they have an education forum that's for educators and learners of any level of nursing. That might be something worth looking at and maybe signposting your students to. I wouldn't use it as part of your learning and teaching explicitly. I would create your own kind of spaces, but that might provide a model of maybe topics to ask or discuss and so on and so forth. Engineering, I had a quick look and there are just far too many to list. So I would say go and look online at common forums that are used by engineers. But again, I would imagine a forum on engineering being perhaps focused on the kind of problem solution and maybe imagination. So you take a picture of a problem that you don't understand, you're working through it, and you just don't get it. You post it to the forum, whether you're the student or the teacher, and then you kind of have people respond. And again, yeah, of course, caveat, please do check these forums before using them or recommending them to students. Last thing, thanks very much for listening. I hope that wasn't too boring. I hope it was useful. Please do look through the notes section of the slides and you'll find any readings or references. And feel free to get in touch. Again, my name is Dustin Hosseini. Thank you very much.